We live in a difficult world, and it's not going to get any easier, even when the financial crisis comes to an end. In fact, it's going to get more difficult. And those of you who are beginning your careers, I think, will face a time of huge challenge which those who are ending our careers did not quite see. Secondly, the crisis, but also these other challenges that are coming up, make us think in a new way about international development. The Millennium Development Goals have provided for the last decade a really strong focus for our efforts in international development. And we've known what we have to do, delivering aid to health and education, to maternal mortality, to gender equality. The world is now not quite so simple. We need to think in a new way about the policy which is going to drive our work. And thirdly, we need to put Europe, for reasons I will explain, right at the heart of what we do. And all of us need to be very much engaged in thinking about how we can make European development cooperation work for the poor of the world. This is not only about the moral imperative of helping people to avoid these costs of malnutrition and ill health. It's also about safeguarding our own way of life. Because if we don't sort out the climate in developing countries, this will come back to bite us. If we don't deal with fragile states, then we are going to have the problem of terrorism and crime and drugs coming back to bite us. If we don't build health systems in developing countries, then when there's a pandemic which starts in a part of rural China, that is going to come back to bite us. And so international development is a moral imperative. Let's not have any doubt about the importance of global social justice, but it is also about common interest. And we need to make that clear and understand how that common interest works and tell that story much more effectively than we do. But there are more reasons to celebrate Hungary, because I think you must never underestimate what Hungary can offer to the developing world through your own history, your experience of transition, your experience of joining a regional organisation, the European Union. All of this is exactly what needs to be heard in many parts of the developing world, in Africa, in Asia and in Latin America. And I know that you have a growing aid programme with an interest in exactly these questions about transnationalism and regionalism. And I've written about the fact, you know, that it is not sensible to talk about development happening in those countries over there and we do something different over here. The boundary between the developed and the developing countries is constantly dissolving. And we have a lot to do in terms of building the conversation between developed and developing countries. The world's population, we know, will go up by 50% by 2050. What is not so well known is that almost all of that increase will be in towns in poor countries. But actually, those of you who are beginning your careers, my advice to you is become town planners. Understand about sewers, about infrastructure, about telecommunications in towns, because 90% or more of the population increase to 2050 is going to be in towns in poor countries. And that might be a good thing. Transactions costs are lower, there is a growth impetus in urban areas. You know, India, lots of poor people, but India is a middle-income country. India sends rockets to the moon. China is a middle-income country. China organises the Olympics. DFID have said that more than 50% of all future bilateral spending will be in fragile states. So if you think you can go into development and work in Malaysia or India or Brazil, then probably think again, because the future of development cooperation is Somalia and Sudan and DRC. And different skills, different people maybe, different training, doing different things. This will be a very different profession in 20 years' time. You know, in 1950 there were in Europe 3 people for every 1 person in Africa. By 2050 there will be 3 Africans for every 1 person in Europe. We're here to celebrate Kapuscinski. I hope you've read some of his books. If you haven't, I do actually recommend them. I first read his book about Haile Selassie, which is a completely fascinating book because it is full of stories. Lots to say about Kapuscinski. The one thing I think that is worth thinking about is that Kapuscinski tells you stories for a reason. It is to illustrate a bigger truth. And those of us who work in research have exactly that responsibility to tell stories, because people listen not to numbers and to tables and to equations, they remember stories. Your job is to take your country, this precious vessel, with its history, its traditions, its culture, and guide it through this period of enormous turbulence that we face. And as I think about this, the image that comes to my mind is a very cold swimming pool and a class of children standing at the end, and the teacher says, I want you all to jump in and swim to the other end. Here are the children, standing shivering on the edge of the pool. One of them is even so frightened he has his hands over his face because he can't bear to look. And what do we know about these children? One or two of them will dive in, will jump out of the other end, will be smiling, and will be ready to do something else. Some of them will jump in and manage to swim. Some of them will jump in and probably drown. Some of them will never get in at all. These are countries, these children are countries. Some countries are equipped through their leadership and their culture and their public finances and their balance of payments position, their resilience, their innovation, their technological scientific capacity. Some of them are able to take on this new turbulence, and some of them are going to find it really, really difficult. And we can imagine, it's not always going to be the case, but we can imagine that many of the countries which find it most difficult are going to be the ones which are currently the poorest and which have been most badly hit by the shocks.